All right, in this video, we're going to look at the miles per gallon calculator. Um, so we have a basic HTML document here, index.html. Basic things in the head. The body has a main section that consists of an H1 for the miles per gallon calculator heading up here. It has a label for miles, and this input, this text input, has an ID of miles. So this is the label for that text input that says miles driven. Okay. And then in this div, we have another label for gallons with a text input with an ID of gallons. That would be this line over here. And then we have another label, miles per gallon, that is set to disabled. Okay. By default, the input type is set to disabled because we don't want the user to type in there. We're going to put the answer in there when it's calculated. The user shouldn't be able to type anything in that box. And then no label down here, just a space, which was still important to have because that causes the calculate button to get moved over here underneath these three boxes. So there's a label there that just consists of a non-breaking space, so we don't really see it. You can see it there. If I highlight it, it's there. But it causes these things to line up properly. And then we have a type of button, ID of calculate, and its value is calculate miles per gallon, which is what appears on the button. Okay. And then link to our JavaScript. Okay. We also have a CSS file that formats our page. We have a body, color for our H1. Our divs get set to a margin, bottom margin gives a little space between our divs. And then we have our labels to display inline with a width of 10 EM. That makes them all the same size and they're all aligned right, which again was why it was important to use that blank label or that label with one space in it, which helped our alignment up here. So pretty simple page in CSS, nothing fancy there. The magic happens in the JavaScript as always. So let's look at our JavaScript to see how this works. All right. So let's look at what's different about this. We have some error checking, we have some calculations. We're doing quite a bit more than we've done in previous versions of this, and we're no longer using pop-ups to get our information or to disseminate our information for that matter. So we start out with use strict, which is important to do always. Then we have our dollar function set up right from the very beginning. That's going to be at the top of most of the code you write from now on. You're going to put that dollar function. That dollar function just abbreviates document.query selector, unless the user just pass in dollar with a selector in it without having to type all this every time. When you're doing a lot of query selectors, it sure does make your code shorter and easier to read. There we go. Then we have a small function here called getErrorMessage, and its job, you can see it when I highlight it here, it gets highlighted down here in the places it's being called. It lets somebody pass in something like miles driven or gallons of gas used, and it's going to generate a custom error message. So if we call it with miles driven, it's going to say miles driven must be a valid number greater than 0. If we call it like they did here with gallons of gas used, it's going to create a string that says gallons of gas used must be a valid number greater than 0. So it's going to custom generate some error messages without having to duplicate a bunch of code. Kind of nice. We have another small function here called focus and select, that when somebody passes a selector, it's going to go out and find that selector on the page, and then it's going to set the focus and selection to that particular thing. And that comes in handy. We'll see down here in the next function. When we want somebody to correct something, it's a really nice feature if it automatically puts the cursor back in the box where they need to correct. So let's go over and test this real quick. I'm going to put in 200 gallons of gas used. I'll put 5 gallons. Calculate, I get 40 miles per gallon. That seems right. But what if I put -5 in here? I get gallons of gas used must be a valid number greater than 0. That's the string that was generated over here. Okay. And once I click OK, look what happened where my cursor's at. It's automatically, everything in there is highlighted, and the cursor's in that box, so that I can just type a number. I don't have to take my mouse and click back in the box, delete the things that are there. So it's a very user-friendly way to do things. So let's look at this process entries and see the magic that's happening there. So process entries is our click method that's going to get called, is our click function. It's going to happen when somebody clicks on the calculate miles per gallon button. Okay. So actually, before I cover this, let's look down here. This is our event listener for our DOM content loaded. When it's loaded, we have an anonymous function here that's going to look for that calculate button, add the event listener so that when somebody clicks on it, it calls this process entries. Okay. So this happens after our DOM content is all loaded. We attach the event listener to the calculate button. All right, now let's look at process entries. We set up a constant for miles, and all it's going to do is use that dollar function, go out and find the item with an ID of miles and get its value. So in this case, it took the 200 out of there and assigned it to miles constant. Okay. It also parsed it to a float, and we had to do that because this is text when it's in the box. We pull it out as text, parse it to a float, store it in there. Did the same thing with gallons. Okay. And now we do some input validation. We check the miles that the user typed in. Did they type in something that was not a number, or did they type in a negative number? If they did, we're going to pop up an alert. And what's going to be in that alert? It's going to send miles driven to that get error message function we talked about up here. And it's going to generate a string that uses this parameter miles driven and substitutes it here. Miles driven must be a valid number greater than 0. Okay. Then it's going to call that focus and select function that we had right here and tell it to focus and select on the thing that had an ID of miles. So if the miles box was okay, we're going to do the same thing with the gallons text box. We're going to check to make sure it's not a negative number, not less than 0. And if it is, we're going to alert the user, and we're going to call the focus and select function to put the cursor back in this box. Okay. If both of those things are okay, then we'll actually, right here, do the calculation, round it to 2 decimal points, miles divided by gallons. We've surrounded that with parentheses and put 2 fixed 2 right on the end of it. And assign that to the value property of whatever has an ID of miles per gallon, which is this text box down here. So we're changing the contents, the value of the text box with an ID of MPG to the result that was calculated here. So that's a lot, and it might be a little confusing. There's a whole lot of new information here. So what I would suggest, if some of this is confusing, go back and forth. If you didn't understand a particular selection, what was going on, go back and watch the video earlier that covered the theory of that thing that you're not understanding, and then come back and look at this again. There's a lot of parts to put together here, but once you put them together, it's really not a very long piece of code, and it does some really great things.